So in our flexibility lab, we're busy spending time looking at some field testing like sit and reach test and shoulder mobility test, and we even looked at the functional movement screen and some elements of that, of just trying to find red flags for movement. And what you're intended to do with that is once you find one of those issues, you're going to dig deeper and start evaluating movement. And we talked about this concept of quality versus quantity of movement, quantity being the total range of motion and quality meaning the control or pain-free range that you have. And what we did here is we would look at, let's say, a client, put them on the table, and we would check internal, external rotation. We would measure how many degrees of rotation they had, and we would look at both the passive range and the active range of motion. If we found any discrepancies, that was a red flag for us. What we were really looking at is at our total range of motion here. We were looking at the relationship between the active range of motion, the motion that's created by the agonist, and the passive range. You have physiological barriers that are keeping you from going further, so your passive range of motion is always going to be greater than your active range of motion. And then you get to these limits, like the mobilization if you were going to stretch someone, and manipulation if you were going to do a joint manipulation. But we're not doing either of those things. Basically what we're doing is getting someone on the table or have them stand, and we're looking for how well they're moving. And like I said, the first thing we're looking at is the relationship between active range and passive range. This should be roughly within about 10 degrees of each other, PROM always being bigger than active range. And then what we're looking at too is making sure that the left side is equivalent or symmetrical with the right. And you would do this at all three planes. So if a joint had 3 degrees of freedom, you'd be looking at flexion extension, ab and abduction, internal external rotation, and horizontal ab and abduction. As I said, quality of movement is more important than quantity of movement, and it depends on the situation. But we want to look at the active range of motion as the quality component, if you want to kind of look at that together, and the passive range of motion as the quantity. And basically what you're trying to solve from this intervention is this setup right here, where you have your joint. Here's your muscle on one side, your agonist, your flexor, if you will, and your extensor on the other. And these should be in a perfectly a balanced relationship. They might be 100% symmetrical, but perfectly balanced. Over time, because of the cumulative injury cycle or trauma, you're going to end up with a muscle that tends to be neurologically overactive, sometimes referred to as shortened, and you would have a muscle on the other side that's going to be lengthened, sometimes referred to as a tightness, and on the other side, weakness. Now, this coexists. You cannot have one without the other. So if you find tightness in the body, that means that you have symmetrical weakness on the other side of the axis. So if you find that your extensors are tight, it's because that might be because your flexors are weak, and it's not because, it's if the extensors are tight, the flexors are weak, which came first? That's the chicken or the egg situation. So if we're here and we're trying to reach for our toes, and we appreciate the human movement system here, is that movement, this movement here of trunk and hip flexion that's occurring, is a product of the brain telling the muscles to generate tension on this side of the axis, and it's telling the muscles on this side to relax. You get the movement at the joint, and the movement occurs. So if I can't go any further into, let's say, trying to touch my toes here, the gap here, I'm trying to produce trunk flexion, hip flexion, I'm limited by my hamstrings, hip extensors, and my trunk extensors. Now, these muscles aren't inherently tight. They're only tight because the nervous system has told muscle to do its only job, which is generate tension. So the agonists are the trunk flexion and the hip flexors, and the antagonist are the trunk extensors, hip extensors. I'm solving this problem here. If I want to improve my movement, my output, I can choose to either hit the weak muscles on the anterior side here, or the tight muscles on the posterior side, or likely we're going to do a little bit of both. So in an ideal situation in muscle balance, you will allow the nervous system will have enough muscle tension to be able to generate the force to pull you into trunk flexion, and the body will also feel comfortable enough to allow these to extend fully into that position. So this is the problem that we're solving, or this is the way that we're intervening to do programming for flexibility or mobility. We're dealing with the weakness or the lengthened position, and we are also dealing with the tightness. And so there's different strategies, as we talked about in class, and you have hardware components that are leading to limited movement, like you actually have muscle adhesions or some knots that need to be addressed, or you truly have a sarcomere limitation, or there's a software aspect where the body is saying, hey, the feedback going back to the brain saying we're not comfortable doing that, we're going to limit range of motion. And it ends up being a little bit of both. So when we look at tightness or weakness, when we look at what is available to us, you basically have two ways of going at it. You can either do the active range of motion where you're working with the agonist to bring you into that position, or you can do some kind of techniques to address the tightness by doing some kind of passive range of motion where you're addressing the antagonist on the other side. So when you're doing the active range, the go signals are going to the brain are going to the agonist, and actually when you're doing the passive range of motion, the go signals or the communication from the brain is going to the antagonist, in this case the hip extensors. And again, you are solving this problem. I'm either dealing with the weak muscles on this side or the tight muscles on the other side. So when you look at that, that dynamic, when we look at the active versus passive, you also have a continuum of static versus dynamic. And when you look at these four basic quadrants of flexibility, you have your active static, active dynamic, and passive static. Now these become your tools, or at least the category of tools that you will use for mobility. Now the passive static is the traditional stretching, get in a position, hold it for 30 seconds or so, and the active dynamic is more of the warm-up activity. These two, active static and passive dynamic, might be a little bit more new or novel, but all four have strengths and weaknesses, and all four affect different aspects. Are you looking at the agonist, the antagonist? Are you looking at active range and passive range? Now, if you remember from class, we had four basic areas, and this is borrowed from the NASM corrective exercise specialist, where you have your four basic approaches. You can inhibit, turn things off, lengthen, try to actually lengthen the tissue, activate, and then integrate back into normal movement. And the two things we're solving is the active range versus passive range, or the symmetry. So once you've decided, the symmetry basically tells you that, hey, yeah, something needs to be addressed, and then you have to determine whether your limitation is in total passive range of motion, because this leg is at 90 degrees. Let's say she can only get her leg up to 90 and this one's going to 120. Well, that might need more passive range of motion to get that symmetry. Or if quality of range of motion is important because the active range of motion and passive range of motion are different, or you have a limited amount of active range of motion because of pain or some kind of mechanical issue, then you're looking at the quality. So you have certain interventions that favor passive range of motion improvements and certain that favor active range of motion aspect. So just as a reminder, when you're doing active range of motion, it's the hip flexors that are getting the go signal. That's where the muscle tension is being generated. And the hamstrings or the hip extensors, they are getting the off signal or the stop signal. So these guys are saying go, go, go. The nervous system is sending the signal there. Once you add, and then the hamstrings are getting the stop signal. Once you add passive component, the relationship of this switches. Instead of the hip flexors getting the go signal for the active range of motion and the hip extensors getting the stop signal, you actually have an inverse component. The hip flexors now are in the stop and are no longer getting signal, and the hip extensors are the muscles that are fighting you from going further into that position. So you have to appreciate that when you do static stretching or passive range of motion type activity, you are working against the nervous system. When you're doing active range of motion stuff, you're working with the nervous system. Real quick, I know this is a borrow from the previous video that we did, but when you improve stability, active components, there is a carryover or downstream effect to your mobility. If you focus on mobility, you focus on passive qualities, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to increase stability. It may or may not. So when you're thinking about if you had to pick between, are you going to work the stability route or the mobility route, it's far safer and far more conservative to go to the stability route, because when you increase stability, you are increasing some mobility. So if you increase the contractile ability of the tissues around the joint, and you've increased strength and you've increased active control, there will be an improvement in mobility. If you just increase length of the tissue because you stretched it out, you relaxed it, you calmed it down, you loosened it up, fatigued it out, whatever intervention you did, you it's a coin flip of whether you increase stability or not. So again, quality of movement is more important than quantity. This is looking at the active range of motion versus passive range of motion. And when you are designing a flexibility program, you have to be considerate of both of these aspects. It's not just how far can you get your leg behind your head. Can you control, and do you have strength through that range of motion as well? So when you look at the active range, it's always going to be a shy shorter than the passive range of motion. When I'm doing the active range, it's the agonist on this side, the hip flexors that are bringing the hip into hip flexion. And then when I'm imposing an external force, this is what I'm overcoming, the muscle contraction that's being generated from the hip extensors. The nervous system is going that way. This is the problem. This is the ideal state that we want to get in. This is what we're presented with. And now we have 4 different domains of which what we can do to solve this problem. So the very first thing was inhibit. So we can try to turn off or turn down or relax the tight tissues. And that was like the self-myofascial release, the massage, the foam rolling. After you've calmed down or turned off the nervous system, you can look at lengthening techniques. This is our different types of stretching, whether it's a traditional static stretching, or if we did some kind of PNF, neuromuscular stretching, where you contracted the agonist or contracted the antagonist and manipulated the nervous system a little bit. The other aspect of is you can start addressing the other side and say, hey, let's leave this tissue alone. Let's activate. Or you could have gone through this process like step 1, step 2, step 3. These are the positional isometrics. So getting yourself into a shortened position and then gently graduating or progressively increasing, ramping up force to try to bias some of those stabilizing fibers. And then the other domain was integrate. So you're either doing eccentrics or you're doing pauses in the isometric aspect, or you're taking single joint activities and including them into the multi-joint component. But ultimately is that when you look at a range of motion issue, you see asymmetry, or you see discrepancy from left to right, or you see discrepancy from active range to passive range. You have a choice of whether you want to solely address the tight tissue, you solely want to address the weak tissue, you progressively want to go from tight tissue to weak tissue, or you go from here. So you have that option between any of these: inhibit, lengthen, activate, and so forth. Sometimes just doing some inhibition techniques is all you need. Sometimes you need to do an integrate, and sometimes if you're doing full range of motion integrative type components, that's sufficient for your programming. So when you're presented with a range of motion aspect like you were in the case study, what you're looking at is you're trying to solve this problem here: the quantity and quality of range of motion. That's driven by symmetry from left to right and the discrepancy between active range and passive range. And then you have at your disposal 4 basic domains and tools within there that we discussed and played around with in class that you can use to change someone's range of motion output.